Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you may be. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I thought we would talk about a small handful of reality television show hosts, specifically the supposed problem-resolving agony uncles, whom we are led to believe have nothing but good intentions to help the guests that appear on their show. So it's only proper that myself, being a UK-based penguin, that I start this topic with a man to whom I believe every British citizen has been subjected to seeing at some point on our television screens, or our newspapers, or more so, an endless barrage of gossip magazines, no doubt. And that man is Jeremy Kyle. Now, on the surface, most people believe that Mr. Kyle's intentions are in the best interest of his guests' well-being, during and, of course, after their time spent on the show. Now, despite how it would be virtually impossible for Jeremy Kyle himself to maintain contact with every single guest that walks onto his stage, there is the little mention that his aftercare team do themselves keep contact with a number of guests who are willing to go through whatever aftercare may ensue. So with that said, and of course we all know to the ever-trusting Graham, always on Kyle's beckoning call, to further handle the rowdy guests as well as Kyle's no-nonsense approach to helping resolve their problems in the first place, it's only natural, as said before, to assume that Jeremy isn't all that bad a lad. But as with most people, from all walks of life, if you scratch beneath the surface enough, you will no doubt get shit underneath your fingernails. So with that, let's divulge into some of Mr. Kyle's personal life stories, and have a look at the real man behind the show. Now, it may come of no surprise that, despite how his attitude seems to be more than willing to flaunt all the good and bad points, obviously, of his guests, Jeremy Kyle himself makes a point of trying to keep his personal life simply that. But for a man who makes his money thanks to the 1.5 million views he gets each and every morning for basically shouting about people's private affairs, I feel no guilt in speaking of some of the controversial topics that surround him. So, with that being said, let's start with something that Mr. Kyle, although reluctant to discuss, doesn't deny, of course, his gambling addiction. Jeremy Kyle's first wife, Kirsty Rowley, to whom he also has a daughter with, went to the Daily Mail and told of what life was like being married to Kyle for just 15 months, which I think says a lot in itself. Apparently, he was a consistent liar when it came to his spending in regards to his gambling, and according to her, he also took money from her bank account without any permission. And of course, this led to thousands of pounds of debt. As well as that, Kirsty claims that Kyle also took every penny from a joint building society account, which requires both signatures, as I'm sure you know, and until today she claims to still be unaware as to how he got away with this. Very strange. Well, going back to the overdraft he ran up through her private account, which came to more than 4,500, Kirsty says, her bank had been trying to reach her via emails, but says that Jeremy intercepted her mail. Well, she of course confronts him about all of this, to which he doesn't deny and becomes remorseful. Shortly after this, Jeremy decides to search low within himself, and in what can only be described as an act of self-pity in order to sway the guilt from himself, he quite cruelly claimed he didn't have long to live. Of course, this turned out to be a load of old flannel, but we'll get back to that shortly. Back to the story of his out-of-control gambling. Jeremy also supposedly ran up a huge phone bill on gambling lines at work. He then had the cheek to say that he was considering suing one of his ex-bosses because she hadn't paid him a commission fee. It reached a point where Jeremy's then father-in-law intervened and made arrangements of sorts with Jeremy and the bank so that, over time, he could pay back the $4,500. Surprisingly, Jeremy stuck to this, but, of course, he wouldn't have had to have been saved by his then father-in-law if he hadn't lied about something else. Kyle had told Kirsty, early when they met, that he had in fact inherited £70,000 from his grandmother. If this were true, then why not use that money to pay off the debts he had carelessly run up? Simply because it was utter chin-strap shite. So again, another lie, basically. So, with the issues in regards to his gambling, as well as the constant stream of lies he was feeding to those closest to him, it's no wonder Kirsty went on to say that he wouldn't look out of place on his own show. That being said, you'd think that maybe Jeremy would make up for these mishaps by at least being a kind, caring husband. But again, according to Kirsty, this wasn't always the case either. She goes on to say that after the birth of their first daughter, Jeremy became very overbearing, controlling, jealous, and unpredictable. His behaviour, one example of this, she says, was an incident where Jeremy wanted to wear a red golfing jumper, and he became upset and frustrated, claiming it wasn't clean. Well, Kirsty simply made a point to him, in future, put it in for washing, to which Jeremy, she says, then got aggressive, shouted at her. "What do you do all day?" he said. And then he also called her a slut, just before taking some scissors and proceeding to cut up the oh-so-precious golfing jumper. Well, if indeed it's true, this story really jumped out at me. In particular the part where he says, "What do you do all day?" On his show, if Jeremy is ever faced with any guest who would talk down to a woman, or use any, let's say, sexist tones, he's the first person to shift into white night gear and jump up and down in a female's defense. So of course, if Jeremy did indeed say and do these things, it just goes to show how much of a walking hypocrite this man really is. Another thing that Jeremy seems to make a point of on his show is having no time for people who basically spread rumours simply for jollies. And yet, according to Kirsty, at least one occasion Jeremy did just that. He went on to inform Kirsty that one of her friends had been criticising her behind her back, and although this wasn't proven, it of course put Kirsty in a position to which she came to lose contact with her once good friend. She went on to say that Jeremy drove many wedges between her and her friends. If all of this wasn't enough, Kirsty also went on to say that he had a habit of just leaving the house when and where, sometimes even for a couple of days or more. So if that is indeed true, so much for Mr. Kyle being the highly attentive father that he constantly claims to be on his show. Of course, with this type of personality, it's little wonder Kirsty goes on to say that he was a very manipulative man, often claiming she had said certain things when she was more than sure that she hadn't. Nevertheless, over time, all of this would make Kirsty feel she had to question herself. She felt she was losing her mind, to put it into her own words. So it comes as no surprise that, as I said earlier, after just 15 months of marriage, which, as I commented before, I really do think says a lot, that they separated in November of 1990, after another escalated argument. Kirsty's recollection of the incident is very brief, in that she says during the row she shouted to Jeremy if he was to storm out one more time not to ever bother coming back, and with that Jeremy Kyle left. Naturally at first Kirsty was indeed upset and unsure what to do. She spoke to her mother for comfort, but soon came to feel a sense of relief, despite now having a 5-month-old daughter to look after by herself, as well as having no job and, of course, debts to pay on Jeremy's behalf. A wonderful parting gift courtesy of Mr. Kyle. But of course this all soon became something of the past. Kirsty went on to marry an old childhood friend, and claims she holds no malice against Jeremy. She goes on in saying that she's come to terms to forgive Jeremy for the debts run up thanks to his gambling addiction, but found it more of a struggle to forgive him for his amount of constant lies and deception. Deep down, she believes it was, like most things, a search for attention and people's approval. She felt he didn't really have a high regard for himself. Not long after their separation, Jeremy went on to begin a career in radio, and at the age of 31, he was working in the sales department of the West Country station, Orchard FM. From there he went on to work at various local stations, until one day in 2004, whilst working on London's Capital Radio, he came to the attention of ITV executives looking for a replacement for Trisha Goddard, and the rest, as they say, is history. And for over a decade now, the people of Britain, and more so lately America, have been subjected to Jeremy Kyle's over-dramatized expressions and constant babbling contradictions. But nevertheless, it's probably no surprise that whilst Kirsty's marriage doesn't seem to be crumbling just yet, Jeremy's 13-year marriage to Carla Germain came to an end in September 2015. As being his second wife. But it wasn't all bad news. Kyle, despite complaining on one show that he doesn't get enough sex, managed to get it on at least 3 occasions, as he now has 2 more daughters and a son. So not only did he manage a bigger litter this time, but he also got the marriage to step over the 50-month mark. Good for him. But before even this was to give him a slap in his terribly tanned face, Jeremy had another black mark put against him back in 2007. Claims were made that Jeremy tried to strike a relationship with then 16-year-old Becky Hayes. Hayes, who was doing work experience alongside Jeremy at Birmingham radio station, BRMB. Jeremy, who was 35 at that time, supposedly took advantage of the girl, who claimed to be starstruck. She went on to say that Jeremy told her he could get her into radio and would make a point of flirting with her over phone calls, and when with her he would kiss and grope her. She also tells of how he wanted her to dress in school uniform, how he would become immediately aroused at her being a virgin, and supposedly invited her to swingers parties. In a statement made by Kyle's solicitor, he of course denied these claims, and his solicitor went on to say that the sole contact Kyle had with Becky was by telephone only, and seeing as it occurred more than 6 years ago, the calls could not be traced. Becky Hayes' work experience paid off though, regardless, and she's now a DJ at Hallam FM in Sheffield. Well, good for you, Becky, and I see you've put it behind you. So I think it's fair to say that what Jeremy Kyle's first wife Kirsty said in regards to him being a fitting candidate for his very own show couldn't be any more true. Taking into account all of what's been said is of course simply that, the truth, if so be it. And even if much of it is, or if it's not, or if it's just going to forever remain unbeknownst, of course for gossip mags and newspapers to naturally only overstretch the truth, as well as often adding little in-betweeners to make stories sound more controversial, sells, you know. Plus, Jeremy Kyle, it's fair to say, has had his own share of ups and downs, not only by what we've mentioned, if be it we try and look at it from his side, especially if much of it is false. It came about that his second wife Carla had allegedly had sexual relations with England polo player James Carr. Mr. Carr goes on to say that he and Carla had sex up to 20 or more times at his rented home in Ascot Berks, sometime after meeting together for a polo lesson. I never knew that's how you played polo. I've been cheated out of my youth. But as said, if this is true, then this makes Carla Germain a naughty little cockhopper. On top of coming to hear this about his ex-wife, Carl was diagnosed with testicular cancer back in 2012, but after some chemo sessions, followed by undergoing surgery to remove the cancerous testicle, little bugger that, Jeremy was given the all-clear by doctors. I'm sure it goes without saying that Jeremy Kyle has had bouts of his own problems to deal with, And yes, even though he's a bloody irritating bastard, he's not exactly Adolf Hitler. So, taking anything and everything said against Mr. Kyle with a pinch of salt, let's just remember that people like Kirsty, Carla, and James Carr all got a pretty penny, I'm sure, for telling their own stories, despite what ridiculous sums of money Kyle makes for himself doing something that I'm sure most of us could do. The bottom line being that, when all is said and done, I'm sure we can just switch our televisions off. So with that being said, I will now take my leave, as I have some incredibly British things to attend to. But thank you all for watching. Thank you more so for those who subscribe, and I'll be seeing you again soon. So wherever you may be, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and of course, good night all.